Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video, you're going to learn all about bleed and how to scale its damage through the roof. Enjoy! Bleed is a non-elemental ailment. It applies a strong physical dot and applies bleeding status to the enemy. So how do we apply bleed? The most important thing to note at this point is that bleed cannot be applied by spells, only attacks. That attack must have a physical damage component above 0, and you must also have a chance to cause bleeding. As you'd expect, the bleed is only applied if the enemy doesn't evade, dodge, or block. As bleed builds tend to favour stronger, slower attacks, a lot of people go Resolute Technique to guarantee that the enemy cannot evade them. It should go without saying that when your primary damage is bleed, that you build your character to have 100% chance to cause bleeding on hit, so that every hit inflicts a bleed. When we land an attack that inflicts bleed, we will inflict a single instance of bleed on the enemy. By default, each instance of bleed lasts for 5 seconds and deals 70% of the base damage of the hit that inflicted it each second. If an enemy that happens to be bleeding is moving, then it will get its bleed damage applied twice again to a total of 3 times its damage, which is 210% of the base damage of the hit that caused it. And this is base damage, so it's before we even start scaling it off the bleed scaling we have on the tree and our skills. So by this point, you might be thinking to yourself, this is absolutely obscene damage. And you'd be right. Because this ailment can inflict such obscene damage, the developers have capped the amount of bleed you can cause to only a single instance at any one time. But this will always be the bleed instance with the highest damage. Now, with the moving and bleed combo being so bloody strong, we always want our enemies to be moving. To make this happen for archers, there is a new skill in the game called Ensnaring Arrow. Now please note, if you are using this, do not use it with Pierce. And that's because Ensnaring Arrow only applies this always moving debuff to the enemy it last hits, and so if you shoot it, it goes through the boss and hits its ad, you then don't get that movement damage on the boss, which would be really bad for you, and your amazing looking damage numbers. Unfortunately, melee doesn't have a skill to do this. However, we can still make them move by knocking them back. Now, this little fact was quite hard to find, and that's because it's buried in the knockback mechanics section of the PoE wiki and isn't mentioned anywhere near bleed. I wouldn't count on this working on every boss, however, because I think some bosses are knockback immune. Now, just a quick example on how the bleed is chosen. And let's imagine I have 1 shot a second and I'm attacking a boss. My first hit applies a small bleed, my second hit applies a massive bleed, my third hit applies a mediocre bleed, and then my last hit applies another low bleed. Now I'll show these bleeds expiring after 5 seconds, and then there'll be a little pointer over the bleed that's currently in play. Now this wouldn't be Path of Exile unless we could change whole game mechanics using a keystone. And bleed is no exception. Introducing the Crimson Dance keystone. What Crimson Dance does is remove the damage bonus when the enemy is moving, and also half the amount of bleed damage we get. Now that on its own sounds pretty awful. But on the positive side, we can now have 8 simultaneous bleeds dealing damage instead of just the 1. Now, providing we can maintain those 8 bleeds on an enemy, we get a total hit percentage as bleed of 280%, which is 4 times base damage instead of the 3 that we get without Crimson Dance. And those 8 bleeds are of course the 8 strongest. We'll talk about when you should and shouldn't use this keystone in a moment when we talk about skills you can use to cause bleed. And now onto the skills, and the first one we're going to cover is Puncture. Puncture is very effective at scaling bleed, and that's because it has a very high damage effectiveness, and also gives us 49% more damage with bleeding once we get to level 20 of the gem. It is limited for use with bows, daggers, claws, and swords, with most people using it on bows. It's not very well suited for clear, and so an alternative skill for clear is well worth it. Most people use Split Arrow because it gives you extra projectiles. We're not going to go into it in detail here because it doesn't really scale bleed. If you are going to use Puncture on a bow, please do not forget to use Ensnaring Arrow, which I mentioned earlier. It really will boost your damage quite significantly. The next skill on the list is Earthquake, and this doesn't even have bleed in its description. I actually played this skill once in the past and hated it with a passion. So the way this skill actually works is you hit the ground, and then about a second later you get an aftershock. Now if you hit the ground more often than the aftershock procs, you only get 1 aftershock until that aftershock's triggered, and then the next one will trigger. So if you fire 5 shots a second, you'll only get 1 aftershock. Now what the aftershock actually gives you is pretty amazing, especially for bleed. And that's because the aftershock deals 150% more damage with hits and ailments. And because the bleed is scaled both on the hit and on the ailment damage, that's 300% more damage. which is obscene. Now this will take our 210% from hit damage and scale it to 630% just with the skill itself. Now needless to say, I no longer hate Earthquake, and we can even hit faster than the Aftershock with no real detriment to ourselves, because only the biggest bleed is going to apply, which really does smooth out the inconsistent damage that you get with Earthquake playing it normally. Now it is still on the slow side, so you want lots and lots of things that boost individual hits to make them the biggest possible. Now with the 2-pass skills I've mentioned, I would avoid using Crimson Dance, because they're both on the slow side. The bow not so much, but once you use it with the helmet, which we'll talk about in the gear selection, that's where you start to slow it down quite a bit. Now I did try the Keystone with the Earthquake, it did not feel great, I've got to say. We lost a hell of a lot of boss damage. Our next skill is Lacerate. This is one of the faster ones. Lacerate gives us 88% more damage with bleeding while we're in blood stance. We also get a flat amount between 5 to 75 and 8 to 113 added physical damage, and it does between 100 and 122.83 base attack damage. Now this skill can scale bleed quite nicely. I have played it before, but having played Earthquake, it just doesn't feel anywhere near as good. And I think there's two main reasons for this. One, they've locked the bleed damage buff to only work when you're in blood stance, and this skill really excels it in sand stance, and that's because of the 50% increased angle while in that stance. Number two is it only gets 60% of its base attack speed, and this makes it feel frankly crappy while leveling, but also the build feels like it should use Crimson Dance and should hit really fast to generate those bleeds. But that 60% of base really does lower your ability to scale it to the nth degree. Okay, the bow character is squishy. We have two more skills to cover, and then we'll be moving on to the specialist equipment and also the passive tree points to scale bleed damage. The next one's a bit of a weird one. It's Double Strike, or Val Double Strike. Rather than give us more bleed damage, it gives us more physical damage if the enemy's bleeding, which in turn increases our bleed damage. To help us get there, it also gives us 25% chance to cause bleeding. Now from what I've seen, most people who do Double Strike do not scale the bleed, they just use it to get more attack damage, and the skill has a lot of base attack damage anyway. So I don't think this is really a bleed skill, but bleeding definitely helps it scale. And I have seen people like Mathel completely destroy bosses with it. Another reason I give for this not being a bleed skill is that you need at least 2 of the link sockets to give you Melee Splash and Ancestral Call. And that's because this is a single target attack, so you have to convert it to give you clear. Our last active skill is Cleave, and this doesn't give us any bleed damage or any chance to bleed, so why is it a bleed skill? So Bleed states that if you attack with 2 weapons at once, it will add the 2 weapons' damage together as bleed. So theoretically speaking, you could have 2 60% chance to deal 100% damage weapons in each hand, and this would give us a very, very large bleed indeed. It's also probably more than the average player can afford, which is why you probably don't see many of them around, if any. Let us really swiftly now include curses and support skills. I won't go into much detail on these, only why I choose them for bleed. There's only one real curse skill if you want to deal absolutely ridiculous damage, and that is vulnerability. It causes the enemy to take up to 39% more damage, at the same time causing our bleeds to inflict damage 20% faster. Possibly the strongest addition to bleed damage is brutality. This stops us from doing non-physical damage, in exchange giving us 60% more physical damage to the attack, and then if you scale the quality you'll get up to 10% increased physical damage. Now the removal of the non-physical damage components doesn't really harm our bleed at all, and that's because bleed only applies to the physical damage component of our attack. Another great support skill for bleed is Deadly Ailments. This gives us more damage with the ailment for 10% less damage with a hit. Now the 10% less damage with a hit affects both the hit and the ailment. It also gives us 10% increased damage over time with quality. And if you happen to be going projectiles with a bow, don't forget to check out Vicious Projectiles, which gives us 6% more physical damage over time. If you have elected to do all your bleed damage using a slam skill such as Earthquake, you absolutely have to use Fist of War support. This causes us periodically at maximum level to deal 148% more damage with hits, 100% more damage with ailments, and 59% increased day of effect. This is absolutely phenomenal and should not be passed up under any circumstances when using EQ. Now this is sat behind a cooldown of 1.8 seconds at maximum level. But remember that using Earthquake, we're only really going to do the damage of our most powerful bleed, which is going to be this one. Next on my list is melee physical damage support, giving us 49% more hit and bleed damage. Now I will mention here, just in case you're not aware, that some of these support gems will not work with the skill you're using for bleed. Please check the tags on your bleed active skill to make sure they're compatible. If you're unsure, ask me in the comments below and I will let you know. The next skill on my list is a skill I wouldn't normally touch with a barge pole, which is Ruthless Support. The reason I don't normally touch it is because the damage bonus only applies every third hit, which gives you really inconsistent damage. But on a bleed build, where only the strongest bleed wins, this is pretty consistent. Pretty consistently high, that is. At level 20, this skill gem gives us 132% more damage with melee hits, and the same again for the bleed caused by those melee hits, which again is very large. The last skill I'm going to talk about today is Swift Affliction. This gives us 44% more damage over time, which affects our bleed, but also 15% reduced damage of supported skills and damaging ailments they inflict. This skill really is delightful for Earthquake because it also reduces the time between the main hit and the aftershock. If you do use a skill that I haven't mentioned for bleed builds, then please do let us know in the comments below. It may help someone out, including me. A couple of active skills I didn't mention here are all War Cries, and that's because they don't directly scale the bleed, they only scale the hit, which indirectly scales the bleed. So you're looking for War Cries that do exerted hits. For the purposes of scaling damage with bleed, what you really want to do is pick damage modifiers that will affect both the hit and the bleed. So here are the damage modifiers that affect the bleed. First, bleeding. So if you type in bleeding into the search, you can see that all of them are concentrated here between the Duelist and the Marauder start locations. So here, these are your main bleed nodes. You've got the Dirty Techniques nodes, you've got the Bloodletting nodes, here's your Crimson Dance keystone, and you've got Red Storm. The other thing that scales is physical damage and damage, with some exceptions. So, for instance, I think these nodes here are physical damage. Yeah, increased physical damage. That will scale your bleed and your hit. But a node like this one, where it says increased melee physical damage, will scale the hit if it's a melee hit, but it will not scale the bleed because that isn't melee. Another great thing to look for is ailment damage. So you can see all of these nodes up here, including these axe nodes here, have ailment damage. So axe attacks deal 12% increased damage with ailments. That will scale the bleed if the bleed was caused with an axe. Same with this. It will scale the bleed if it was caused with a sword. And if you put Lionized Fall in here, these will be converted to bows, so all those ailments will affect bows only, which is why you can scale bows really nicely off these nodes here. Now you can see this is much more widespread, but there's not a lot over here in the Templar and Witch areas. It's all located around the Shadow, the Archer, the Duelist, and the Marauder. Also, flat physical attack damage modifiers will also scale the bleed. What else do we have? Damage over time. So these must be qualified with physical or not qualified at all. So this one says fire, so it will not scale our bleed damage. And this is an 8% to damage over time modifier for bleeding, so that scales. Again, damage over time with bow skills. So you just need to make sure that when you look at these, they say physical or they're not qualified. So let's find one. I think these are chaos damage over time. So they won't scale us because bleed is a physical damage modifier. Also note that damage over time multiplier is much more effective than damage over time. You got some nice bow stuff down here. Let's run down from the top. We have flat damage, physical damage, damage over time. That is physical, not specified, or to your particular weapon, or bleeding. You've also got bleeding damage, and then you've got flat physical damage and damage from ailments. Nothing else will really scale the bleed components, unless the bleed is caused by a trap or mine. Now if you do decide to cause your bleed with a trap or a mine, then trap and mine damage will also scale the bleed. And all your trap and mine damage nodes are up here in the shadow part of the tree. And you've also got this physical node here, and all of these physical nodes here. So maybe you also want to create some kind of bleed poison hybrid, and it's possible to do that with these nodes up here. It's not very often done, but it can be done. Another great place for Lionized Fall, if you're on this side of the tree, is here, which will capture these claw nodes. On the Ascendancy front, there's only one clear winner, and that's Gladiator. It has two nodes specifically focused on bleed. The first node is Blood in the Eyes. This gives our attacks 50% chance to cause bleeding. Attacks will maim on hit against bleeding enemies, and it has 25% chance to blind with hits against bleeding enemies.
So that's both offensive and defensive, and on top of that, enemies maimed by you take 10% increased physical damage. The next node is Gratuitous Violence, and the power of this node is rather large. Basically, bleeding enemies we kill explode, dealing 10% of the maximum life as physical damage. Meaning if we kill like a rare or unique, anything around it is going to pop. And it does make a reassuring popping sound, which makes it all that much better. And then the extra thing that gives us is 20% more damage with bleeding. Now that isn't the only option. I mean, if you're doing something like Lacerate where you really want attack speed, then you can also try things that generate rage to give you that attack speed, such as the Berserker, which also has this 40% more damage, which will affect our bleed and our hit, which can be quite massive. Onto the items now, and I'm going to focus only on the items that we deal with at the end game. And ideally for weapons, you actually want the rare weapon, not a unique weapon. And that's because rare weapons influence with Elder, and of eye level 83 or higher, 60% chance for bleeding inflicted with this weapon to deal 100% more damage. And we can get this mod on practically any weapon base. So you may be thinking to yourself, okay, 6% chance to deal 100% more damage is really good. But that's not what this gives you. It basically means you always hit with 100% more damage with your bleeds. And that's because we can only inflict the heaviest bleed, or bleeds if we're using the Crimson Dance Keystone. And frankly, that's almost impossible to beat. Now, to ensure we're scaling this the best way possible, we also want to get on this weapon increased physical damage at the highest roll we can get, and flat increased physical damage. And at the time of recording, one of these weapons with all three of these stats will set you back somewhere between 1 and 12 exalts. If that's a little rich for your liking, then get 2 of these stats and you can get it for somewhere between 20 and 25 chaos. But you definitely want the 60% chance for bleeding inflicted with this weapon to deal 100% more damage as one of those. And disclaimer here, prices in Path of Exile are controlled by the market and are at the whims of the player. Now the next 2 items I would only suggest if you haven't gone Gladiator, and they are Void Heart for the 50% chance to cause bleeding if you haven't got it on the tree, and also Hemophilia. Hemophilia gives you 25% increased damage over time. It gives you a half power Gratuitous Violence at 5% explode damage, and it gives you 40% increased attack damage against bleeding enemies. But it reduces the bleed duration by 25%, which is 1/4. And if you want to try your hand at some crazy crit build, take a look at the following weapons: Kondo's Pride, the Inimity Divine, the Yielding Mortality, or the lovely bow, the Crimson Storm. And again, for me, for the easier, more damaging build, I would tend to go for the rare weapon over the uniques. And if you are interested in leveling weapons, Google PoE Bleed, and then pick the wiki and scroll down towards the bottom where it gives you a list of all the items that scale bleed, or at least get a chance to bleed. Next on our list is the pretty dapper Lislatha's Coil. This looks something akin to an earwig which you wrap around your waist. It also doesn't mention bleed, but is probably a really good item for bleed. So what does it do for us? It decreases the minimum damage and increases the maximum damage that we can deal from our weapon, thus increasing the total range of damage that our weapon will do. So losing damage deliberately seems a bit odd, so why would we do that? Again, this is magical bleed, where only our strongest one matters, so all these lower ones won't actually do any damage. Which means that for all intents and purposes, this is a 40% more damage multiplier. And also sports a rather nice 100 maximum life, and 50 life gained when we stun an enemy. And as we're doing all physical, that could be quite a lot. You may also want to check out the rather niche Vino Puncture. If you can work out how to reverse the effect of chill, this could be a really nice item if you don't go for the Gladiator. And if you are interested in this, to reverse the effect of chill, take a look at the Winterweave Coral Ring. Now, apart from the reversal of chill, it is pretty useless to us though. I cannot believe that I almost missed this item out of this guide. Assailant. It is the helmet used by most bow bleed builds. On the face of it, it looks like it doesn't do anything with bleed, until you look at the snipe skill it grants you at level 20. What snipe does is basically allow you to charge your bow skill up to 6 times. Each time that you charge it will give you 165% more damage on hit and 120% more damage with ailments. That is a staggering 990% more damage to the hit and 720% more damage to the bleed. There is no words for this other than absurd. which is why this skill can one-shot most bosses in the game once this character is built. I'm talking bleeds of over 60 million damage. The one drawback is the character just feels so squishy. If you don't like dying, you will not like it. I'm actually still trying to make it feel not terrible to play, because I really want to see what this does against Cyrus. Okay, moving on to the last section of this guide now, which is cluster duel notables. The first one to take a look at is disorienting wounds. The second is rend. If you want to do a poison bleed hybrid, then steady torment looks quite impressive. If you are going to do some kind of impale bleed type thing, bear in mind that impale does not scale bleed, then vicious skewering may help you. And another nice one if you like leech and recovery of leech and then some nice damage over time multiplier for bleeding, vivid hues is a rather nice touch. And then last but not least, we have compound injury, which gives us 50% increased chance with bleeding that is inflicted on maimed enemies. If you have any questions on the guide, you can leave them in the comments below and I'll try and answer them as quickly as possible. Or if you'd like a more interactive approach, join our Discord server. The link will be in the description below, and you can also check it out in the About section of our channel. And with that, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time. You've been watching Altec 2K. Thank you for watching.